It's the distinguishing characteristic between the wannabe tyrants and the true leaders. The true leaders say, here's an offer. Would you accept this of your own free will? And the tyrants say, the apocalypse is coming and everything, and we are allowed to do everything to forestall it. Right, including control you and everything that you do.
So recently, Jordan Peterson was on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he talks a little bit about compulsion and the power of force and how you can determine whether someone is a tyrant or not. So spoiler alert, there's always an apocalypse, but I think there's some interesting insights here, so let's watch and let's react.
Just the psychological warfare that was played on the American people. You remember that very famous White House post that they made for the vaccinated, you've done your job, but for the unvaccinated, you're looking forward to a winter of severe illness and death, and the hospitals that you will overwhelm. Like, that was the White House telling you something when it was in Omicron by that point, which was like a cold. Like, it was crazy. The deaths had dropped off radically, but they were so in bed with the pharmaceutical companies that they were like, you got to do it. You got to get vaccinated. And if you don't, you're looking forward to death and severe illness. Like,
absolutely. And I think we're through 4 severe winters of illness and death, of severe illness and death, while us unvaccinated got through it and we're not just corpses stacked up in piles. What they did was unconscionable. Even to Joe Rogan, they pretended he was on some horse dewormer because his doctor told him to use ivermectin, which helped a lot of people, by the way. Using force and compulsion to enforce the lockdowns and the vaccine mandates was just horrendous. There were religious worship restrictions and assembly restrictions. It was just an insane period, and not enough can be said about the evils of the villains that perpetrated it.
Imagine, you're not basing this on real statistics. You're not basing this on science. You're just basing this on this control, this fear element that you're trying to impose upon people.
So that's an interesting point there too, that issue of control and fear. You know, I was part of a group that started this organization in the UK called the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. We had our second convention in November, which went very nicely, by the way.
So you're doing like a positive counter to the World Economic Forum.
Yeah, well, we have some rules. And one rule is you don't use force or fear, right? Use invitation. So can I tell you a story about that?
Please do.
Okay, so I've been touring about this new book of mine, right? We Who Wrestle with God, and it's I've been lecturing about lots of the things I know, but I've been using biblical stories mostly to provide an analytical frame, because that's what stories do. They provide a frame. And there's a great story in the continuing Exodus story, the story of Moses and the Israelites, where Moses has led his people away from the tyrant and away from their own slavery, because there's a dynamic in that story between those two things. No tyrants without slaves. Or you might say no tyrants without willing slaves. And so the Israelites have to get away from the tyrant, but then it's across the Red Sea of chaos and blood and into the desert for 40 years. You don't escape from the tyrant if you're a slave without paying a price, and maybe for 3 generations. It's rough. So Moses is trying to get these people to stop being slaves and to take responsibility so they don't need a tyrant. And so he's kind of got there, and they're on the edge of the promised land, right? And so they're almost at the end of their voyage. And
this is a great story, by the way, and if it's going the way I think it's going, there's a really great lesson here, so let's hope so.
They run out of water. They're still in the desert. They run out of water, and they get all whiny and bitchy about the fact that they had to go across the desert and that it was way better under the tyrant, and that Moses is nothing but a corrupt patriarch, and he's only power mad, and they foment some rebellion. And anyways, it's a pretty ugly situation. And the Israelites go to Moses and they say, look, we're really starving. We're thirsting for water. We're going to die. Do you think you can have a chat with God, see if he'll do something about this? And God tells Moses to go to some rocks in the desert and to ask them to bring water forth. And so he goes with his people to these rocks, and instead of asking, he takes this staff of his, The staff is a really important thing. It's like your staff if you have an organization, same derivation. But it's also the magic wand of Gandalf. It's the flag you plant in new territory. It's the tree of life. It's the
sign of your own authority, or that you've been given some kind of authority or power by others.
living tradition that has a spirit inside it, and that's a serpent, and that's the serpent that eats all the serpents of the Egyptian tyrants, magicians. That's the staff. It's his rod of his authority. And he, instead of asking the rocks, he hits them twice with the staff. So he forces them. And God tells him that in consequence of that, number one, he's going to die. And number two, he's not going to get to the promised land. Right. So there's this insistence. It's really interesting. Well, it's a crucial insistence. And it's very important in this time, I think, to understand what this means. So Moses is a leader. He's the archetypal leader. And he realizes his responsibility in the encounter with the burning bush, which is something that attracts his attention, that he takes with great seriousness, and that transforms him. And so then he becomes the leader who stands up against the tyrant and frees the slaves and takes them through chaos into the desert.
I think with great power comes great responsibility, or with authority in general comes great responsibility. And I know there are many listeners of this channel that are religious and some aren't, but whether you're religious or not, or whether you believe in this story or not, I think it is really telling and timeless what this means and what it represents. And that's that compulsion is wrong. That's that voluntarism is the thing that separates liberty from tyranny. And Moses defied God's will in striking the rock, rather than speaking the water into existence, which would have satisfied his people without having to use force and without striking it. And from that right there, you can extend that to essentially every issue that we talk about in terms of politics and what separates right from wrong. It's usually voluntarism.
And his temptation as leader is to use force. So when he's a young man, for example, he kills a Egyptian aristocrat who was tormenting a Hebrew slave, and that's why he has to leave Egypt. He's tempted by power because he's a leader. And then at the end, even though he's done all these things, he's been an upstanding man and gone beyond his call of duty. And he's right at the point where he attains victory, right, to enter the promised land. And he uses force once. When God tells him to use invitation, to use his words, the logos, to use words, to use invitation. And that's enough so that he's dead. So is his brother Aaron. That's his political arm. And he doesn't enter the promised land. And then in the Gospels, of course, Christ forgoes power altogether. The temptation in the desert, one of the three temptations is the temptation for use of power. So one of the things that maybe we could conclude from all this, given the context of what you said, is that you can tell the tyrants, they use fear and compulsion. And they don't use invitation. So one of the rules we put together for ARC was invitation only. Play, we're going to do this playfully.
Yeah.
And we're not going to use force or fear, ever. You have to use invitation.
So this is super interesting, and I think a super important lesson that totally speaks to me and my dissident libertarian sensibilities. The only thing I would say here is that I wish that Peterson would take this lesson, so invaluable that it is, and apply it to every realm of politics. Because how do you think the IRS collects taxes from us? It's through the threat of fear that we'll be imprisoned if we don't pay them. It's through coercion. And in the last moment, it's all based on a gun. It's all based on force. In the same way, accepting the surveillance state. And, all the revelations we got from Snowden regarding what the NSA is doing with its PRISM program. They use the threat of fear to divulge that information. He's forced into exile because he did that through the compulsive mass data collection. When it comes to the warfare state, how do you think that our overseers, our overlords, the warmongers support the warfare state and support subsidies to the military-industrial complex and all the empire building? It's through the threat of force. They seize our earnings from us and apply it elsewhere via coercion. It's not through voluntarism. If it was voluntarism, they would set up, some kind of website to take voluntary requisitions or donations from the public to do that. Same thing with Israel. Peterson's a pretty avid supporter of Israel. There's things I like about it, Peterson, but that's not one of them. And politicians that are Zionists use threats of fear to continue that money funnel going. They say, if not for that, all of Israel's rivals will simply overtake it and accomplish Hitler's mission, 80 years after Hitler had wanted it, or something like that. Something absurd that says, well, if you don't support Israel, you're just a Hamas sympathizer. That's the same line they use in regard to every theater, but also in Israel. That's how they justify continually funding the Israeli state. These are just a few examples, but you can see what I mean. That the application of this is perfect and the lesson is perfect. I just wish it could be universally applied. And that's what I think that some people that are not as sympathetic to libertarianism are a little bit missing out on here.
And so I don't know what you think about that. Imagine it's the distinguishing characteristic between the wannabe tyrants and the true leaders. The true leaders say, here's an offer. Would you accept this of your own free will? And the tyrants say, the apocalypse is coming, and everything, and we are allowed to do everything to forestall it. Right, including control you and everything that you do.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Right, and that's how they get people to fall in line. They fall in line through fear.
Yeah. Well, fear and force. It's like also, you have to do this because the apocalypse is looming, which is always in a way true.
Always.
There's always an apocalypse of one form or another looming. The question is, what do you do about it?
And this is so true, and that's what my biggest fear is about the implementation of the COVID regime and the precedent it's set. This was all predicated on a mass propaganda campaign of fear, that this abstraction in the air would essentially wipe out the human race unless we took these very rigid, government-focused, centrally planned safeguards against it. Individual decision-making in regard to evading it, who cares about that? Let's throw that to the wayside and just adapt the one-size-fits-all government model. Well, that stuck for, off and on 2 to 3 years. Various states had it in the U.S. that was more strict and restrictive than others, of course. I'm in Tennessee. Thankfully, we didn't see the worst of it here, certainly. Although there still were strict measures in the Nashville area during that time. In other parts of the state, it was way worse. But my big trepidation here is that in the future, these same people that created that apocalypse narrative will just create a new apocalypse narrative. It might not have to do with a disease or a pandemic or an abstraction in the air. They might say, well, hey, there's a climate crisis, and because of this, we have to reinstitute these lockdowns. And what gives us the right to do this? Well, we did this before, and you didn't punish any of the perpetrators for doing it before. And even conservatives like Ron DeSantis did it before when he shut down Florida. And they can cite all of those things to justify a new crisis. It's a manufactured crisis to implement political control. That's what we saw in the COVID regime. They might do it with guns. They might say that there's, a runaway gun catastrophe that we have to suppress through these measures. That's my biggest fear. And Peterson's right on about the lessons we can learn here. I just wish more people would apply this to more realms of life than simply the COVID regime.
Well,
and terrify
people
and compel
live
them.
Anywhere in the world right now, right? You might be experiencing the apocalypse right now if you live in Gaza.
Yeah,
you might be experiencing the apocalypse right now if you're in Yemen, if you're a Houthi, right?
The end of the world is always coming. Mm-hmm. Right, and for you, for me, for
everybody.
Yeah, right. So you can always look into the future and conjure up an apocalyptic scenario, and maybe even that in itself isn't a sin, although I think it is. There's another, but if you then turn to fear and compulsion as your means of governance, then you're a tyrant. I don't care what your excuse is. It has to be invitational.
That's when it gets scary, when you see governments telling people that they have to fall in line, or these are our horrible consequences for you not agreeing to what we're saying. Yeah, and then if you don't do this, you're a part of the problem.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, and if the apocalypse that's generated in that way is of sufficient magnitude, there's no limit to the amount of power that can be exerted.
Right.
Because obviously the rationale is there.
They have to do it, right? Like this is the rationale to stop Trump, right? You're trying to stop Hitler.
Yeah, so true. They'll use any excuse in the book to conjure up these crises and hold people to the strictest standards of them, lest they threaten to take away their rights. That's what they did during the COVID regime. We had lockdown orders and curfews, and people tuned into their radio and television sets to find out if their state governor was going to allow them to leave their house that day. This truly was totalitarianism on the American doorstep in a way that had never happened before, certainly not in my life. And it was crazy. So the lesson here is well learned. This is a great lesson to divide how we can determine whether someone is being a responsible and moral leader versus a tyrant. It is compulsion. That's the ultimate ingredient that separate the two. And there is a part of humanity throughout history that is drawn to these tyrants that have cult of personalities built around them, you know, from Caesar to Napoleon to Oliver Cromwell to modern presidents that were just sick and twisted in their methods to exert violence against their people for the consolidation of power, wealth, and control. We see that in the last century completely, especially since the progressive era in the US. But again, I hope that Peterson or others that are speaking about these things would apply them to other realms in politics, like the warfare state, the surveillance state, the deep state, the taxation apparatus. It's an extortion instrument. And all those things feed off fear and compulsion. That really is the catalyst of government. That's the engine of government. And that's what should be dreaded and guarded against. So I do want to hear what you guys think, though. Is Jordan Peterson right about this? Is this a good lesson to learn? And do you think we should apply this to all areas of politics? Let me know in the comments below. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Take it easy, guys. Peace out. I'll see you in the next one.